Happy Chanukah, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Torah studies class, Chanukah. Every victory is worth celebrating. You don't have to win the war, so concentrate on the battle. So last week, I'm going to my twice weekly physical therapy appointment, and my physical therapist asked me if I'm having family over, if we're going to have a special holiday Chanukah meal, because he knows from his other Jewish clients that every time there's a Jewish holiday, there's a unique special holiday meal. I didn't really know how to answer that question because the whole question of whether or not there is a Hanukkah meal is actually the topic of tonight's class. Through answering this question, we're going to be able to address another really important question as well. And that is, how come in life it's a lot easier to criticize than it is to compliment? And we're not only addressing this question to how we view other people, but tonight we're primarily going to look at how we view ourselves. Why is it that that it is much easier for us to criticize ourselves, to be more frustrated with the failures that we have in life than it is to celebrate the incredible accomplishments that we have? Why is it that we focus on the negative and not the positive? What do I mean by that? For example, let's start with a student. A student is doing fabulous in school, getting excellent grades. One class, you don't do that well, and you get all bent out of shape like everything is a disaster. And someone might point out to you that you have fabulous grades in these other classes. You say, oh, but those other classes are easy. This is really the hard one. And they didn't get a good grade. There might be a mother of many, many children who not only is a mother to all of her children, but works full-time and does so much for the community, but she's down and upset at herself that maybe the house is not as clean as she would like it. But look what you're accomplishing. Look what you're doing, the children that you're raising and the organization that you might be leading, yet we tend to focus on the mistakes, the failures in life. This also could apply to the way that a person views their religious life. A person might be putting on tefillin every single day, but might be upset and frustrated and down with themselves because their observance of Shabbos is not so great. But the tefillin is fabulous. The tefillin is beautiful. Why do we tend to be down on ourselves and critical of ourselves? And of course, what does Hanukkah have to teach us about this attitude, and how can Hanukkah help? So just a brief recap of the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah took place in the 2nd century before the Common Era, so approximately 150 years or so before the Common Era. The Syrian Greeks were in control of the land of Israel, and they were putting intense pressure on the Jews to secularize, to Hellenize, to adopt all facets and elements of Greek culture. It came to a head where a small amount of Jews began to actually rebel and revolt. This led to an intense war with the Greeks, and there was an incredible miracle that the weak overcame the strong, the few overcame the many. When the Jews were going to rededicate the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, which had been defiled by the Syrian Greeks, they ran into a problem. There was only enough pure oil to light the menorah for 8 days, but a miracle happened, and that oil, the 1 day's worth of oil, burned for 8 days. And this, of course, is the holiday of Hanukkah. The question, of course, is asked, why is it and for what reason do we actually have a holiday called Hanukkah that we celebrate for 8 days? The Talmud answers the question by describing the miracle of the oil. The Talmud says, why do we have a holiday called Hanukkah? It's because of the oil that lasted for 8 days. It barely even mentions the fact that there was a military victory. If the Talmud was the only text that you looked into to discover the reasons for and behind the holiday of Hanukkah, you would not even be aware of the military victory. From the perspective of the Talmud, Hanukkah is a celebration and an acknowledgement and a thanks to God for the miracle of the oil. Now, if you look in the works of the Rambam has a slightly different approach to why we celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. He does not only mention the miracle of the oil, but he spends a lot of time explaining to us the nature of the military victory of the Jews over the Greeks. So he says, why do we celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah? for both reasons, for the military victory and for the miracle of the oil. Now, this leads to a few questions. Question number one is, how could the Rambam seem to be, and I quote with quotes here, contradict the Talmud? The Talmud says the reason is the oil. Why does the Rambam bring the military victory into it as well, when it seems pretty clear from the Talmud that Chanukah is about the oil and not the military victory? The second question is in reverse. The military victory was absolutely critical for the miracle of oil to happen. No military victory, there is no miracle of oil. No military victory, maybe there's no Jews today. So how could the Talmud omit the entire miracle of the victory? And the final question is, at the end of the day, we still have the same mitzvahs, we still have the same laws, we still have the same traditions that surround the holiday of Chanukah. Whether you're looking at Chanukah from the Talmudic perspective, or you're looking at Chanukah from the perspective of the Rambam, at the end of the day, it's the same mitzvahs, the same holidays, the same traditions. So why do we care? Why is it an issue? Why does it matter that the Talmud mentions one and the Rambam mentions both? What is the practical application? What are they really arguing about? So, of course, the answer is that they're arguing about food, right? So often, so many things in Judaism ultimately come back to what we're going to be eating. As I mentioned earlier, every Jewish holiday has a meal component. Even Yom Kippur has a meal component. It's a mitzvah to eat on the day before, on Erev Yom Kippur, just as it is a mitzvah to fast, and there's a mitzvah to eat a meal at the conclusion of Yom Kippur as well. So even fast days get in on the mitzvah meal. What about Chanukah? Does Chanukah have a mitzvah meal associated with it? From the perspective of the miracle of oil, if the reason and the motivation for the holiday of Chanukah is to commemorate the miracle of the oil, then there is no mitzvah to have a meal. Because the mitzvah which commemorates the miracle of the oil, we fulfill through lighting the menorah and praising and acknowledging and thanking God for the mitzvah, and the meal is not necessary. If we are commemorating the holiday for the military victory, which our very lives were threatened and our lives were then saved, then it would be incredibly appropriate that we should have a physical meal to celebrate the fact that our lives were physically saved. The Rambam's approach is that a meal is absolutely necessary, just as a meal is necessary on Purim. Now we're going to read text number 3b here. We're going to start with text number 3a. I want to give a brief biographical insight to Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the author of the Arba Turim, also known as the Tur, because I think it adds a little bit when we appreciate who is the person who is saying the idea. So Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher was born in the year 1269. He passed away in 1343. He was a halachic authority and codifier. Rabbi Yaakov was born in Germany, but he moved to Toledo, Spain with his father, the noted halachist Rabbi Asher, to escape persecution. He wrote the Arba Turim, for short it's known as the Tur, an ingeniously organized and highly influential code of Jewish law. He is considered one of the greatest authorities on halacha. And this is what he writes. He writes that Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg would say that the many feasts some stage during the days of Chanukah are only optional. There is no mitzvah to serve a special Chanukah meal, since the holiday was not established as one of feasting and drinking, but rather one of thanksgiving and praise alone. So we see this long-standing position from a Ashkenazic halachic authority that the mitzvah meal is optional on Chanukah because the main miracle we're commemorating is the miracle of the oil, and we light the menorah. However, there is another opinion, and this is the opinion of, sorry, it didn't show up there on the screen there. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, wrote a book called the Bayis Chadash, known as the Bach. He was born in 1561. He passed away in the year 1640. He was a rabbi and author born in Lublin. Served as a rabbi in many communities, most notably in Krakow, Poland. He is known as the Bach, the acronym for the title of his work on the tour called Bayis Chadash. He also authored many other works, including the Haggadah Bach, consisting of marginal notes to the Talmud, Rashi and Tosfos, trying to verify and establish the proper reading. He was very wealthy and thus was able to support many of his pupils. So he writes, as a matter of law, I tend to disagree with Rabbi Meir of Rottenburg. Inasmuch as the custom of eating festive meals on Chanukah is already widespread and has been supported by the great rabbis of previous generations, the Maharshal also writes that the Rambam implies as such by describing Chanukah as being days of joy. Rabbi Shalom of Austria writes explicitly that on Chanukah one should be joyous and partake in festive meals. So here we have two different opinions as to whether meals are going to be, whether the meals that we eat on Chanukah are a mitzvah or not. From a practical standpoint, there is no halachic obligation that we must eat a festive holiday meal on the holiday of Chanukah like on other holidays. However, the custom is to in fact gather together with family and to have Chanukah meals. So when a person has a Chanukah party, when a person has a Chanukah meal, a gathering where people come on Chanukah, you could actually count that as a mitzvah. And we see this in text number 4, which is from Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, also known as the Ramah, a primary Ashkenazi commentary on the Code of Jewish Law. He was born in 1525, passed away in 1572. He was a halachist. The Ramah served as rabbi in Krakow, Poland, and is considered the definitive authority on Jewish law among Ashkenazic Jewry. The Ramah authored glosses known as the Mappe on the Shulchan Aruch, and Darkei Moshe, a commentary on the halachic compendium, the Arba Turim. He writes, the many meals which we add on these days are voluntary meals, since the sages did not establish them as days of feasting and joy. The Ramah, some say there is somewhat of a mitzvah to add meals, because the altar was rededicated during those days. The prevailing custom is to recite hymns and songs of praise during these Hanukkah feasts, and then they are in any case considered mitzvah meals. So on a practical level, it is a beautiful mitzvah to gather family together and to celebrate Hanukkah, even though the primary reason that we celebrate Hanukkah is not the military victory, rather it's the oil. Nevertheless, it's a beautiful mitzvah to gather together with family and to have a meal. This leaves us with the question, if it is so important to have a meal together with family on Hanukkah to the extent that we are willing to call it a mitzvah, and this in fact is Jewish tradition, why doesn't the Talmud mention it? Why does the Talmud omit the entire military victory in its discussion on the holiday of Hanukkah and chooses to only mention the oil? So to understand that, we want to go back a little bit to appreciate the historical significance and surroundings of the holiday of Hanukkah. When the story of Hanukkah took place, the Jews already lost control of the land of Israel for already 400 years. The Babylonians, the Persians, and now the Greeks. So the Jews have been dealing with a foreign occupation for quite a long time, and generally speaking, the Jews had submitted to the rule of the foreign entities, and life was relatively peaceful. The most famous example of this is when Alexander the Great, came to conquer the land of Israel, and the Jews made a very interesting peace treaty with him that's discussed in the Talmud. And as a result of the peace treaty, the Jews pledged to name their children after Alexander the Great. From that time until today, the name Alexander has actually been incorporated as a Jewish name. My son has the name Alexander, not as his English name, but actually as his Hebrew Jewish name. So for 400 years, the Jews have been under foreign control. And for much of that time, it was in fact peaceful. The Jews were left alone to practice and to observe Torah and mitzvahs. However, the period of the Syrian Greeks the years leading up to the story of Chanukah, things became much more difficult. The Syrian Greek Empire was involved with many, many wars. They needed to tax their people mercilessly to pay for them. The Jews were very much affected by it. There was an intense pressure for the Jews to secularize and to adopt Greek culture and practice. When Antiochus became the Syrian Greek leader appointed to rule in the land of Israel, right, he started making things miserable for the Jews. Every single position of leadership and authority within the land of Israel was stripped away from traditional Jews, and people were put in power who emphasized the Greek and secular way of life. There was a small group of Jews who refused to abide by this, and the bans became even worse. Shabbos was banned. Rosh Chodesh was banned. The observance of bris milah, circumcision, was banned. The temple was defiled and was made impure. So a small group of Jews leads a military revolt against the Syrian Greeks, and miracle of miracles, they win. As we said earlier, the few over the many, the weak over the strong. Now, what was the calling card? What was the battle cry of the rebels, of the Jews? They were called the Maccabees. First of all, the Maccabees were led by Kohanim. They were led by priests who served in the Beis Hamikdash. They were led by Yehuda HaMaccabee. It was not about politics. The goal, they were not interested of getting the Syrian Greeks politically out of the country so they could once again be ruled by Jews alone. That wasn't the goal. It was religious, it was spiritual. Maccabees is an acronym for Micha Moicha Be'elam Hashem, who is like you among the heavenly powers of God. To be a Maccabee was to say, Greek culture, I'm not impressed. Greek culture, I'm not interested. We are Maccabees. Who is amazing, as powerful, as deep, as pure, as holy as the God of Israel who gave us the Torah, which we are willing to risk our lives to defend. They used to cry out, Mi la Hashem Elai, whoever is for God, come to me. So they chose to fight. Why did they choose to fight? It was not about politics. It wasn't about sovereignty. It wasn't about self-rule and self-determination. It was about one thing and one thing only, and that is religious freedom. The ability for a Jew to serve God the way that the Torah demands of a Jew to live and to behave. Let's go to text number 5. This text is from Rabbi Mordechai Yosef, Rabbi Mordechai Yafi, known as the Levush, a commentary on the Code of Jewish Law. He was born in the year 1530. He passed away in 1612. He was a student of Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, who we just read about in the previous text. He was served as the rabbi of Prague, Lublin, Hurdana, and Posen. He was one of the leaders of the Council of Four Lands, a central body of Jewish authority in Poland. He authored the Levush, a code of Jewish law that is more comprehensive than the concise style of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch. He writes, Purim involved a decree by Haman to physically obliterate the Jewish people. As such, it is fitting to celebrate the physical survival of our nation by engaging in the physical pleasures of eating and drinking. By contrast, Chanukah is a celebration of the victory of the Jewish spirit over the pressure exerted by the Hellenistic culture. The Greeks did not threaten to kill the Jews, but rather issued decrees against the performance of numerous Torah commandments. Antiochus did this as the common practice of conquerors, imposing their faith and culture on their victims, after which all he would do was tax them and nothing more. Therefore, Chanukah's main focus is spiritual, to give thanks and praise God, who helped us regain our independence, thereby preserving our religious identity. Therefore, what is the reason that the Talmud omits the military victory? It's because Chanukah is not about the military victory. It was important. And there is a custom that we do have meals, but that's not the mitzvah. That's not the essence. That's not why we celebrate. That's not why there is a holiday of 8 days. It's because of the oil. And the oil is the perfect representation of why we were fighting. We weren't just fighting so we can have a menorah. We were fighting so we could light that menorah with pure oil, with holy oil, as the Torah dictates and commands. So therefore, the mitzvah of lighting the menorah is at the center and the focus of our holiday. But then again, we have what Rambam tells us, and which is actually the custom that we have today, is that we must also commemorate the military victory as well, and therefore any meals that we have associated with Hanukkah can be considered to be mitzvahs as well. So based on what we've discussed so far, I think it's pretty clear that Judaism encourages celebrations during Hanukkah and encourages celebrations in general. All the Jewish holidays are fantastic celebrations. The personal events that take place in our life, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, things of this nature, absolutely celebrated. There's another thing that the Torah encourages us to celebrate. If a person concludes studying a tractate of Talmud, Jewish law says that is an opportunity and an occasion for celebration. Have a meal, invite people over, and having that meal is in fact a mitzvah. Now, if this is the case, that Judaism so strongly emphasizes that we have celebrations as a constant in our life, even celebrating things that a person can argue is quite minor, how come in so many other areas of our life, we tend to take the more critical and negative look? What do I mean by this? When it comes to celebrating the conclusion of studying one tractate, how come nobody says, why am I celebrating? I still have 20 more that I didn't study. Why am I celebrating because I finished one? Nobody says that. When it comes to the conclusion of celebrating one tractate, it's a beautiful simcha. We invite people over and have a fabulous meal. Yet in other areas of our life, we tend to focus on the negative and we minimize the positive. The first thing we have to realize is that we all make mistakes, right? We're human. Nobody is perfect. We are not tzaddikim. We're not righteous. And as we're going to explain, we're not meant to be tzaddikim, perfectly and wholly righteous. So we are all going to make a mistake. That's not the problem. That's not the issue. The issue is the second mistake. The mistake that we make as a result of the fact that we're human and that we're making mistakes. What is that mistake? It's when we identify with our mistakes. People often mistake their actions for their personality. They allow their mistakes to actually define us and be who we are. When considering success, we feel like fraud based on previous failure. Because we are identifying with our mistakes, we decide that the mistakes truly are us, and any successes that we have, they pale in comparison, they pale in significance, they're nothing, they're minor, they're little, because that's not who we are. Those are aberrations. The mistakes are actually who we are. However, Hasidic philosophy has quite a different approach, which lends to a very different attitude and perspective on life. Hasidic philosophy says that inside of us there exists two souls, two drives that have completely different agendas that are constantly battling for dominion and control over ourselves. There is the animal soul, which its only drive is self-preservation and self-gratification. That's all it's about. Then we have a godly soul. The godly soul is all about selflessness, purpose, meaning, the purpose of life, and so on. Which one is the real you? Hasidic philosophy teaches us that the animal soul, which is interested in self-gratification and self-preservation, that's not the real you. That's temporary, that's finite, that's limited. What that means is anytime we sin, anytime that we make a mistake, anytime there's a failure that is a product and a result of the animal soul, that's temporary. That does not define us, that cannot define us, because by definition, the animal soul is something which is temporary and limited. It is in fact the godly soul that defines you. It's the godly soul that was you before you entered the body. It's the godly soul that is the essence of you while you're in a body, and the godly soul is who you are after your soul leaves your body. Therefore, when your godly soul has a victory, any victory, that victory is real, that victory is true, that victory is permanent, that victory is who you really are, not the animal soul. And this is critical because at the end of the day, it's all about the attitude, the lens, the perspective with which you view life, which is going to determine your positivity, your energy, your confidence as we go through life. Conventional wisdom says, if a person struggles with morality, with ethics, with parenting, with relationships, with religion, with Torah, with mitzvahs, with anything in life, that is proof that you are a failure. How come you don't have moral clarity? How come there is no perfection in your behavior? You're a failure. However, this is exactly the opposite of what the Torah and the Hasidic perspective has to say. Text number 9a, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, Tanya chapter 27. I don't know why there is no biography of him in this book, but he's the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. He passed away in the year 1812. For this reason, no person should feel depressed, nor should his heart become exceedingly troubled, because though he may be engaged in this conflict for the rest of his days, perhaps it was for this very reason that he was created, for this mission to continually overcome evil. The Alter Rebbe says, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi says, depressed? A failure? Absolutely not. This means you are a normal human being. A normal human being has struggles. A normal human being goes back and forth between the animal soul and the godly soul. But when we remember that the animal soul is temporary and the godly soul is real and permanent and who we are, we recognize that every victory really matters. It's really true. Because the battle between our godly soul and the animal soul, this is the game of life. And every victory is truly a victory. Every day, in a spiritual sense, is the Super Bowl. And every victory that we overcome the animal soul, it is just like winning the Super Bowl. Text number 9b, the Alter Rebbe continues. Indeed, the rabbis of blessed memory have said, he who has passively abstained from committing a sin receives a reward as though he had performed the mitzvah. Consequently, one ought to rejoice in controlling his thoughts, just as he would when performing an actual mitzvah. Moreover, sadness on account of the propensity to negative thinking only comes from conceit. He simply does not recognize his place. Hence, he is sad at heart because he has not attained the rank of a tzaddik, while the righteous are certainly not troubled by such foolish thoughts. So the Alter Rebbe tells us, if you have the expectation to be perfectly righteous, a tzaddik, then your failures will get you down. But that is not our expectation. That should not be our expectation. God did not create us that way at all. We are human beings with struggles and with failures. And again, this is the game itself. But we have to appreciate that every time we suppress something, not even an action, but even a thought, for God, this is the greatest of successes. Because every time we sin or fail, it is not inscribed on some type of scorecard. It's in the most erasable, temporary pen, ink, or pencil that you could possibly imagine. However, when we do any type of mitzvah, any type of good, positive deed, even something as minor as pushing a thought out of our mind, it is chiseled in stone for eternity and becomes part of our most real and true identity. And this should have a huge impact, again, on the attitude that we bring through life. The Rebbe makes a beautiful comment in relation to this when it comes to celebrating a bar mitzvah boy. A person can argue at a person's funeral, you can celebrate their life, their accomplishments, their achievements. At a bar mitzvah, you did nothing yet. What's there to celebrate? So here we go to text number 10. One can never know how they will end up. Oh, sounds like we're missing something. Hold on a second. I want to make sure we're not missing anything here. Oh, that is the beginning. Okay. One can never know how they will end up. As the sages say, never believe yourself until the day you die. How then can we celebrate a birthday before knowing whether we will succeed in our mission? What are we celebrating? The answer is simple. A central tenet in halacha is that every Jew is treated with the assumption of being righteous, meaning it is assumed that every Jew surely follows every one of the mitzvahs. Maimonides attributes this to the core identity of a Jew. Every Jew innately wishes to perform all the mitzvahs and distance themselves from sins. Moreover, this status can be reacquired at any moment. As it says in Tanya, any average person can reach a state where they are considered to have never sinned. So when a young person becomes a newly obligated bar or bat mitzvah boy or girl, we joyously mark the day and celebrate. We know they will prevail. Right? Again, this is such a beautiful idea here that we could ask, what is there to celebrate in the inner struggle? That we were entrusted with the mission to win. This itself is a cause for celebration. And as the Rebbe quotes from the Rambam, that the true and real identity of every single Jew is a desire to fulfill all of Torah and mitzvahs. And the fact that we have a struggle is telling us that what we do actually matters. We're in the game, right? We're not on the bench. If there's no struggle, that means you're not playing, right? The joy, the excitement, the happiness of being on the team and knowing that we're entrusted with the sacred mission and that our true identity is our godly soul, that should give us all the fortitude that we need. But what if we still find it too hard? It's difficult, it's challenging, there's a struggle, there are obstacles in front of me, there's a part of me that is just not cooperating. For this, we turn to Chanukah. On Chanukah, there's a prayer that we say, the Ve'al Hanisim prayer. What does it say? We thank God for delivering the mighty into the hand of the weak, the many into the hand of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton sinners into the hands of those who are dedicated to your Torah. The Hasidic approach to this prayer is that this is not only speaking about the historical military victory that took place, but this is the way that God treats every single one of us in our own lives as well. It's not just about a military victory, but this applies very much to our spiritual struggles and challenges. And God gives us the strength to have the spiritual victories that we need, even overcoming the greatest odds. Text number 11, again from the Rebbe. The message of Al Hanisim should encourage anyone wishing to return to God, even if you were very recently impure or even wicked, etc., overwhelmed by evil inclination, or you felt helplessly weak and few in the face of your nemesis. Still there is hope. You must know that your true identity is holy, righteous, and dedicated to the Torah. This is who you really are. Internalizing this will enable you to overcome the past. Every one of us will eventually come around and build our personal temple. Just as it happened in the temple with the Maccabees, we will empty ourselves of all the toxic waste. Then we will clean and purify our temple until finally we will light up our souls with a flaming passion for good. We will then merit to thank and sing praises to his great name. So to conclude, we must remember that you are worth celebrating and that your true identity is not what you do. And Chanukah reminds us never to give up fighting. So to just recap, the reason that we celebrate the holiday of Chanukah is to commemorate the miracle of the oil, because the reason that we fought the battle and that we fought the war was to save the soul of Judaism. Therefore, the central mitzvah of the holiday is to commemorate the miracle of oil with lighting the menorah. Nevertheless, there was an incredible military victory, and we acknowledge that by gathering friends and family together to have celebratory meals. They may only be customary and not obligatory. Nevertheless, they do have the status and the stature of a mitzvah. And one of the messages that we learn from this is how important it is that we celebrate every spiritual victory that we have in life, and that we recognize that any failures that we have, those are temporary, those are finite. Do not allow that to define us. Do not allow that to take away our positivity. Do not allow that to affect our mood. And when life gets challenging, we recall the miracle of Chanukah. It was the weak over the mighty, it was the few over the many, that when we develop and internalize this attitude, we will have the strength and the character to be positive, to be confident, to be optimistic, and to live as proud Jews the way we are meant to do. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a fabulous Chanukah and a wonderful Shabbos. Have a good evening.